When Jim asked me to do a presentation, I thought I could do it in two different ways. One is do something exceptionally technical, or I could just talk about papers I like. So I decided to do the latter. I'm going to just tell you about 8 or 9 papers written about networks using an experimental approach that I really like and that have inspired me and continue to inspire me. Some of them, are mine, so forgive me for a little bit of self-promotion. But most of them are not. And the other kind of caveat is none of them are about health, and only one of them has been published in sociology. So if there are sociologists here. And the reason is I think there's a lot of opportunity. Most of these experiments have been done in management or in economics. I once sent a paper to ASR, an experimental paper, and the reviews came back. Interesting stuff, but sociologists don't do network experiments, so try to find another venue. But I hope that's going to be changing. All right, so what I'm going to begin with is kind of why field experiments. So network analysis, I think kind of, the framework that I've been really thinking about over the last couple of years is like, why study networks? And are networks, do they really matter? And so the kind of conclusion that I came up with is that networks are not real. They are merely representations of an exceptionally messy reality. And they allow us to get traction on very hard aspects of the human experience that are really complicated. People's relationships are complicated. There are not ties that turn on and off. And so it's a representation of the world. And allows us to do a lot of really interesting things and say a lot of interesting things. And so we've made a lot of progress there. But one area that has often been a challenge for network analysts, and I face this as a graduate student, when you submit kind of observational data, reviewers come back and say, I don't know if this effect is real or not. And there's ways that you can deal with what we'll get into, problems of causal inference by having ever more complicated models, ever more controls in your models. But there's also another approach that I learned about kind of at the tail end of graduate school, just some papers that were being written just then, not a lot of papers at that time, trying to take an experimental approach to doing network analysis. And these papers kind of fell into 2 buckets. One of them were experiments online using kind of subjects on Mechanical Turk or other online platforms. And I think these are really powerful, so don't get me wrong. But they also were limited because they didn't allow me to say things about things I really was interested in, like education or learning or businesses. But then I also found that there were people working on field experiments, actually going out into real settings in the real world, trying to see whether they could leverage networks to change outcomes of interest, like whether students do better in school or whether businesses succeed or fail. Actually, the latter one is something that people have just started to work on in the last 2 or 3 years. I think the first paper on that topic will be published perhaps in the next year. So this is pretty new and cutting edge stuff. So field experiments are what I'm going to talk about, not lab experiments. So field, real people, real meaningful outcomes, like how well someone does in school, for instance. An experiment, and I'm going to use that term very broadly. So in the early days, people didn't have actual experiments where they went in and randomized a treatment and a control. They were lucky that someone else did the randomization for them or did something close to a randomization that they could use the resulting variation to make a causal inference. So an example I'll talk a little bit about later are studies that look at the effect of classmates and roommates on performance in school. But randomization into conditions done by an experimenter or naturally in a field setting. So those are the 2 kind of frames that I want you to keep in mind. Real outcomes, real people, and randomization into conditions. There are actually hundreds of questions you could probably ask about networks using field experiments. But I'm going to focus on 3. And these are large, big categories. So one is kind of questions about peer effects. And this is really simple. Does a person J influence the behavior or outcomes of I? I think that peer effects framing of a network experiment is pretty common. It actually encompasses kind of most of what we care about. Next is network formation. What affects whether I forms a network connection with J? Is there something about the context they're setting, about their situation, about the information that they have that increases or decreases their likelihood of forming a tie? And then I think one of the most interesting and exciting areas that I have only seen one published paper on is designing networks. Which network structures will maximize network level outcomes? That is, how do I design, for instance, communication patterns in this group in order to maximize total learning in this group? Or how do I distribute information in a network that has some sort of structure such that everyone gets this information as fast as possible? And the really interesting stuff that's going on now basically tells us that actually many of our simple models do translate into these larger scale field experiments where the representation, the simple representation of a network, actually maps onto how people behave with all their complexities, with their personalities, with how they interact, with the fact that their network ties change, that their relationships are complex. And many of these things hold, but also other things that some of our theories actually don't scale when you take them into real context. OK, so I'm going to start with peer effects. And let's start with a really, really simple issue, which is the problem of causal inference. The standard peer effects design. Has anyone read peer effects research? Probably most people. Wow. OK. So I'm going to be actually teaching something. Great. So there's a bunch of papers on this. Charles Mansky, who's at Northwestern University in the early 90s, wrote a seminal paper that said, actually, people have been trying to estimate peer effects, social influence effects, for a long, long time. He said, but the problem is we really can't trust these estimates. And there are several reasons for that. And he highlighted 2 in particular that said, basically challenge our ability to interpret whether there are any social influence effects at all. And I'll walk you through them. So kind of a classic example is there's Alice. And Alice has good grades. And she's friends with Bob. And so we're interested in whether Bob, by interacting with Alice, will he also improve his grades? The way we basically go about answering this question in the simplest form is we have data where it's like Alice and Bob, Bob and Alice, Raj and Sam, Sam and Raj, they're paired together. And then basically we have their grades, right? And we run a regression. We have the outcome, which is A score as a function of B score, and beta 1 is a coefficient that we get out of this. And that is what we're trying to interpret as, hey, this is a network effect. This is the degree of social influence where Alice is affecting Bob's performance. If that coefficient beta 1 is positive, we say, hey, there's social influence going on here. If it's negative, there is social influence, but it's negative. And if it's null, basically beta 1 is broadly 0, there's no influence. Now, what's the problem with this estimate? Does anyone know? Can you tell me? What's the problem with this estimate?
Shouldn't Bob's effect on Alice cancel it out?
Bob could also affect Alice, right? We don't know whether the channel is Alice to Bob, but it could also be Bob to Alice. What else? Yeah.
We don't know whether Bob and Alice may have selected each other.
Right. Maybe they're both really good, and as a result, we're not picking up the influence of Alice on Bob, but the fact that both of them are actually good students, and that's why they decided to study. Is that a network effect anymore? No, not the way we think it is, right? So you guys actually highlighted 2 of the problems that Charles Szymanski wrote in his paper that's cited now several thousand times. Good job. There are actually 3 problems, but they broadly can be classified as the reflection problem. In a regression where both of A's outcomes and B's outcomes are measured at exactly the same time, we can't tell the direction of causality, We can't tell if A is influencing B or B is influencing A. We may be actually picking up the influence of B on A. So he said, unless you have a lagged independent variable, that channel from your independent variable to your dependent variable is confounded by the channel of your dependent variable actually causing the independent variable. Selection, right, is similar people are more likely to interact. So we're not really picking up A's effect on B. We're actually picking up the fact that they're similar, and they were similar before they even interacted. There's also another thing called common shocks. It could be that people who are interacting have common contexts and common experiences. Two people are roommates, and they have a really, really noisy neighbor. They bang on the wall. And what ends up happening is both of their grades decline, not because of any network process or social influence, just because their contexts are similar. And the problem of causal inference in networks essentially boils down to these three issues. Can we get rid of them? And in a sense, what ends up happening is that there's imbalance, right? So people who are treated with having a good roommate or a good peer that has good grades may actually be very different than the people we see having not so good study partners or good roommates. And there's imbalance. And what randomization does is it creates balance, right? It says, all else equal, the people in our treatment group and our control group are exactly the same. Does that make sense? And they're exactly the same not just on observables, all the things that we see in our data, but on things that we don't see. So when I basically flip a coin here, and I say half of you are going to be in my treatment group and half of you are in my control group, what ends up happening is, purely based on the randomization, I make sure that on average, the number of males and females in each group is about the same. People's heights are about the same. People's general interest in eating chocolate is about the same, even though I don't observe it, right? And it says, OK, now, because they're about the same in both the treatment and control group, what's the only difference between the two groups? The treatment effect, the treatment and control. And because I've balanced, I can say, well, if there's a correlation between the treatment and outcome, it can't be due to anything else. It can only be due to that one thing that I varied, which is the treatment and control. And that's what randomization gives you. It allows you to control for things that you see and control for things that you don't see. So this was a theoretical argument that Mansky put forth in the 90s. People tried to deal with it by using very complex regressions or including lots and lots of control variables, which kind of create some sort of balance, but they never really ended up getting close until 2002. OK, well, let me show this pretty graph. And so the identification problem that we're solving is how much of beta 1 is actually peer influence, right? So is it all peer influence? Or is it entirely something else that you're picking up? Is it context? Is it the fact that two people who are really similar selected to each other, and so on, right? And so you want to know where you are on that spectrum. And the size of B1 is kind of what's going to tell you how big the extent of network effects are. So how do you deal with the problem? Lag the independent variable, include controls that account for dimensions on which people may vary, include features of the context. But you can include only so much, and that's why randomization matters. All right? It creates balance between treatment and control groups, reduces the likelihood that unobserved factors of selection or context are causing the observed effects, and treatment condition characters. This is because treatment condition and the characteristics of pairs are uncorrelated, right? So I don't assign you to a treatment group based on who you are. It's just completely random, and so it's uncorrelated with who you are. I think I probably already said that. So the paper that really kind of opened the door for network experiments, I think, in field settings, is a paper published by this professor of economics, Bruce Sacerdote, I think I'm pronouncing it correctly, at Dartmouth. And so he got a data set from Dartmouth University, which had information on an entire cohort of students at Dartmouth. And Dartmouth, like many other universities, requires all students to live on campus in their first year in dormitories of about 2 people. Some people have 2 roommates rather than just 1. And what Dartmouth does is based on general preferences, or general kind of things like male and female students don't live together, but aside from that, everyone else is randomly assigned. So he looked at that data and he said, huh, you could use that data to basically test whether there are causal peer effects, causal social influence effects. So he got this data and he basically has outcomes, which are the first year grades for these Dartmouth students. And he has all their high school transcripts and their SAT scores. So what he does is he looks at their first year grades as a function of their randomly assigned roommates' high school performance. And what he ends up finding is really interesting. He finds no effect of social influence on academic performance. He finds a correlation between the roommates' grades in college and the actual students' grades in college, but no effect that meet all three of these conditions. Now, this paper, though it didn't find causal peer effects that met Mansky's conditions, opened the door. People said, oh my gosh, we now actually have a framework for thinking about how do we get causal peer effects. So based on this paper, basically there was a cottage industry of people that said, oh, my college also has random assignment, and my college has random assignment. And I have this data too. Oh my gosh, let's run some regressions. And basically over a 7 or 8 year period after 2001 and 2002 when this paper was published, you got dozens, maybe close to 50 or 60 studies in a variety of journals that essentially used this framework with randomization to test for peer effects. And you know what they found? Everything. They found, they found that sometimes there were peer effects, sometimes there were not peer effects. Sometimes they were for men, sometimes they were for women. Sometimes they were for people only in frats. Sometimes it was for something else. The results were all over the map. All over the map. So now the question is why, right? And so I was a graduate student when kind of this stuff was going on. So I wrote a paper with a co-author. And one of the thoughts so you have to keep in mind one other thing about these people who were doing these studies. These were all economists. And the peer randomization into roommates, they weren't thinking about networks. They were just saying, oh, there's an instrument we have where people are randomly assigned to roommates, and let's just see the effect of randomly assigned roommates on the outcomes. So I was trained by a networks person. I am a networks person. And we don't really think about like a randomly assigned roommate as a relationship. Like that's like, oh, I have a randomly assigned roommate. We talk about friends. And so one of the thoughts that I had was, well, most of these studies really don't actually look at the relationships that people form. And so what we did is we actually had a college, my co-author is a government official in India, and he was kind of advising a college who was just starting up in India, and they had about 2,000 students in their entering cohort, and they randomly assigned them to roommates. And I asked them, hey, would you mind allowing us to do network surveys as well? Could we ask these students who they studied with, who their friends were, who they interacted with on a regular basis, kind of those 3 questions. And could you also give us their grades? So we had a couple of things. We had high school outcomes on very standardized exam. And in India, you take standardized exams that are really, really comprehensive. They're not like the SATs. They actually measure knowledge in a subject, not whether, yeah. And they're multi-day exams. And then we actually had their performance on exactly the same grades for 3 years. And so we had a lot of consistency. And so we ended up finding and I posted their thing here, their table here rather than mine, sorry. But what we ended up finding in our paper in ASR was there were massive peer effects. Massive in the sense of about, the peer effect was about 10 percent of the size of the effect of your own prior performance, which is pretty large. That means that like your randomly assigned roommates had about 1/10 of the effect of your own history of doing well or poorly in school, which is a lot, which could basically change your the decile you're in. But we found actually the network data taught us a lot. What we ended up finding was that only the students who said they studied together were the ones we actually had peer effects in. Without the formation of that relationship, of the network tie, there was actually no peer effect. And that kind of convinced me that we really need to think not just about the randomization, but also network analysis, basically the idea that there is a relationship needs to matter as well. And what we also learned was there wasn't kind of a general spillover where I have a smart roommate, I become smart also. The learning was very narrow. If my roommate was really good in mathematics, I improved in mathematics. If my roommate was actually good in English, that performance improved. And what we realized from kind of this study that we did and is kind of a reevaluation of all the other research that had come before it. Previously, people basically looked at, I get randomly assigned to a roommate. My roommate may be a history major and I'm a math major. Like, why would you ever expect any spillover in terms of learning from that pairing on average, right? It's not like my roommate's going to be able to help me out on my homework. And so the thing that we learned out of it is that you really can't just say, oh, I have a smart roommate or a bad roommate. You have to really think about what it is that they have, the kind of knowledge that they have that's actually being transferred. And the other thing you have to know is that they have to have a relationship. And that relationship has to be the conduit through which this information is transferred. So I think that's kind of the thing that we learned. And then after we published this paper, we've actually been seeing a lot more research that have essentially confirmed our findings. Here's another paper. I don't know if people have seen it. It's another field experiment on networks. Unfortunately, fortunately, Facebook's been in the news. It was mentioned last time. There was an experiment on 61 million people on social influence and political mobilization. Basically, what they did was essentially a standard peer effects design, but slight variation. Before, the design what looked like this, where Alice has good grades. That's just a characteristic of her background. Does it affect Bob? Here, they did something a little bit different. You have Alice, and what they did is they sent Alice on Facebook a message saying, hey, you should go out and vote. And then they looked at, A, whether Alice went out and voted, but also whether Bob, who was her social connection on Facebook, was a friend on Facebook, went out and voted as well. And they find that, yes, it did. So they said the messages not only influenced the users who received the message, but the friends and friends of friends. It's like, wow, that's amazing, right? But you go further onto it, you realize that nearly all the transmission, actually all the transmission occurred between close friends who were more likely to have a face-to-face relationship. These results suggest that strong ties, basically actually having a relationship, not just being a random Facebook friend, was the spread of this online behavior. And so it taught us not only about the fact that for peer influence, which is what we were interested in, can spread over networks, but the actual nature of those ties matters a lot. And I think that has convinced me, this study has convinced me even more now that as network scholars who are doing field experiment, we have to really think about what is the relationship that matters. And my sense is we're still pretty ad hoc in terms of how we ask network questions. And we don't really have a standard battery of network questions that we ask. But kind of our study and this study suggests that definitely that relationship matters. And actually, it's quite amazing, right, that they could kind of go in and randomize the messages, and they have these other people going out and voting. There's another paper called Do Your Online Friends Make You Pay? It was, I think, published 3 years ago. Again, kind of online setting. They looked at, I think the context was Last.fm. They don't announce it on the paper, but you can tell it's Last.fm. And they basically say, all right, I'm going to give Alice a product that she would have otherwise paid for. Does Bob buy the product? Right? So does the peer effects design make a lot of sense to you guys? It's very, very simple, right? Again, they found pretty serious peer influence. And guess what else they found on who had the highest adoption? So people who had few friends on Last.fm, meaning that they probably only connected with people they actually knew, that they're real friends, were the ones that basically had the spillover effects. So this is a pretty standard peer effects design, and now I think you can, if you go onto the journals, you'll see it everywhere. It's very, very simple. There's two kind of flavors of it. One is kind of what we did, which is we randomly assigned people to interact with somebody else, measured the characteristics of the peer before the interaction, and then looked at whether that correlated with the outcomes of the person who we're interested in, like my roommate's grades on my grades in the future. Or we have a network, and what we do is we basically randomly treat some nodes in that network. We give them information, and then what we do is we look at people around them and see whether they're more or less likely to adopt a product or a behavior if someone that they're connected to was given this randomized treatment. And those are really relatively easy to implement as these things go. Let me just tell you one more study that I have that we're working on now. So one of the big questions in organizational theory and strategy is, do firms learn from each other? You know, small businesses, the owners often talk to each other. They get advice from each other. Do they have, does advice actually have an impact on firm performance? So when we started the study, actually, no one had studied peer effects using firms. So the channel is two founders talk to each other. A founder comes back, goes to his firm, makes a bunch of changes, and then the firm either hires many more people or is more or less likely to survive. So what we did is we did a field experiment with 100 startups where we gave startups, paired startups with peer mentors, some of them who had implemented very formal management practices in their organization, like they met with their employees regularly, they set formal goals and so on and so forth, and other people were paired with mentors who didn't do that, that they were kind of laissez-faire, like, yeah, everyone can do whatever they want. And then what we did is we observed the firm performance for over 2 years, and to look at basically did the firms that got advice from these more formal managers versus the firms that got advice from these less formal managers, were they more or less likely to survive? And here are the results. What we found is that firms that got advice from these more formal managers grew 28% larger over a 2-year period, and they were 10% less likely to die. And you can see the divergence in these two groups just in our descriptives. What I'm beginning to convince myself of is, yeah, network effects are truly real. You can actually use these to change even firm-level outcomes. And the most interesting thing about both of this effect, again, is we find what we found in the student study. It was only the founders who were located in the same city that were randomly paired. They were all across India, actually. The founders who were paired, randomly assigned to be mentored by people in the same city as them and followed up with them over the 2-year period that experienced the treatment effects. So the formation of that actual relationship mattered immensely in the size of the treatment effects. So as you can see, people tried to answer a variety of different questions, but the framework's exactly the same. There's really no difference, and the regressions are exactly the same. There's really no difference. Once you have that randomization, you can actually apply that modular kind of technology into a lot of different places and answer some very interesting questions. Like, do people's health knowledge, for instance, improve if you give someone that they know this knowledge? What about the nature of the relationship affects whether that knowledge spills over or does not spill over? I think it opens up a lot of really interesting questions that we haven't actually, I tried to look for field experiments on health and networks, and I couldn't find any. And so I think there's just a lot of value potentially there, potentially about learning about health behaviors that way. All right, so now we got kind of dyadic spillovers, like does A influence B, out of the way, the next question is network formation. So networks are not exogenous, right? We form networks because of information that we have, interests that we have, people who we want to talk to, and potentially what we want to get out of them. And part of this question we're really interested in understanding is what makes someone want to connect with somebody else. So I found this one awesome experiment that I liked. It's not exactly a network experiment, but it is. So it's an online dating website, one of the largest in the United States. And what they did was, it was pretty awesome. The authors gifted a random sample of the users on the site the gift of anonymity, that they could browse other people's profiles without other people knowing that they browsed them. Is there anyone that's like a Massive Attack fan? No one? Yay, look at that. Awesome. So like Massive Attack, there's like a line and like blue lines. I was looking back at to see if you were looking back at me to see me looking back at you. Anyway, so they did this. Half the sample, or a random proportion of their sample, basically had the gift of anonymity. They could basically browse without anybody else seeing that they browse. And they found something really, really interesting about people's behavior when they had the gift of anonymity. They found that compared to the control group that didn't have the gift of anonymity, the users treated with the anonymous anonymity became disinhibited. They viewed more profiles, and they are more likely to view same-sex and interracial mates. It's also pretty interesting. But what other really interesting thing about it is that in terms of actually finding a match, the people who were anonymous were hurt. They found less matches than the people who were not anonymous. And what they said is there was an issue of weak signaling. By visiting somebody else's profile, I'm weakly signaling that I'm interested in you. And that serves to have the other person say, oh, let me look at the other person, and maybe there's a match, and I can communicate back with them. And they found that anonymous users who lose the ability to leave a weak signal end up having fewer matches compared with their anonymous, non-anonymous counterparts. This effect of anonymity is particularly strong for women who tend not to make the first move and instead rely on the counterparty to initiate the communication. So we learned something actually quite profound about human behavior by a very, very simple manipulation in terms of who can see who visited whose profile. We learned about people's search behavior. It becomes very different. So it tells you something about network formation when people don't know you're trying to form networks with them. And it also said something about actually matches, because so weak signaling sends information about kind of the back and forth dance that ends up happening in any kind of relationship, whether it's romantic relationships like this one, but also in other professional relationships, whether people actually want the contact. People need to have that first signal to kind of decide whether to move forward or not. And so that was a very elegant experiment to do that. And all they did was change the information that people had in these two conditions about other people in the network. So I thought that was a cool experiment on network formation. Here's another one. They did this experiment at Harvard Medical School. So a big thing that everybody's interested now in is interdisciplinary research. Scholars in immunology should be talking to scholars in computer science, or kind of interdisciplinary. And so Harvard Catalyst, which is a kind of an umbrella organization that does a lot of kind of work at Harvard trying to create these connections and also commercialize scientific discoveries, ran a field experiment that was also a 60-minute kind of a 90-minute information sharing session. So what they did was they basically got a whole bunch of Harvard professors together, and they asked them to kind of present like 10-minute descriptions of what they were working on to other people who were Harvard professors or researchers. And then they followed up with them a year and beyond to look at whether these people actually ended up co-writing grant applications together. And the basic finding, which is basically propinquity, is that people who were in the same seminar room together were significantly more likely, 75% more likely, in fact, to co-author a research grant together, just based on this 90-minute intervention. But what was the most interesting aspect of their findings was that the people who ended up forming these research collaborations through these interactions were not people from different disciplines. They were actually people that were often right next to each other in the hallway, but had never spoken to each other. And they were in the same department, but they had never spoken to each other. Which suggests, I think, that the idea that propinquity is ever so dominant as a force in social life may not always be the case, and that there's actually an immense amount of search frictions in social interaction that prevent people who would likely be beneficial to each other may not actually even know about each other or what they do. They only find out because of a random conference organized by some Harvard researchers who told them to give a few-minute presentation. So what was the research design here? Really simple, right? Here, what they said is, we have a whole bunch of people. Some of them are in this room, some of them are in this room, and some of them are in this room. And what they do is they look at, are the people in the same room versus the people who are in different rooms more likely to collaborate with each other? Yes, they are. And who are the ones that are in the same room that are more likely to collaborate with each other? They're the ones that are similar and were actually nearby each other. And again, kind of the space and similarity come back into play. OK, here's another paper my co-author and I have. So we have 3-year data on networks, pretty 2,000, sample size of 2,000 over 3 years. People were randomly assigned to roommates in the first year, randomly assigned to roommates in the second year, and then we measured their networks in their third year. And what we were really interested in is that there's been a lot of studies looking at, well, I put 2 people together in a room, they form a connection. And someone will say, well, that's obvious, right? Like propinquity. We were interested in whether, the thing about networks is that they are not static entities. They change, and people just don't form one tie. A tie is a window into a social world where I connect with you, and you introduce me to people that you know that introduce me to people you know. And we were really interested in whether you could get differences in the size of someone's network based on just 1 or 2 people that you introduced them to, and the kind of qualities of that person's network. So for instance, there's person A and there's person B. Person A gets randomly assigned to one person, and person B gets randomly assigned to another person. And I'm interested in how the interaction with these 2 people affect the size of person A and B's networks in the future. And what we say is basically, is whether if person A's randomly assigned partner has a big network and B's randomly assigned partner has a small network, does that spill over? Do the networks fold in on themselves over time? And can we identify that causally? And actually, we did. We find basically very strong evidence that basically if you interact with one person and they have a very large network, that's going to have much larger effects on your network, and that's detectable 3 and 4 years down the line, just because of how the networks close in. So kind of our main treatment effects, we find that if you get randomly assigned to a large person with a large network, as a roommate, your network becomes larger, you move closer to the center of the overall network, and you end up becoming more likely to end up becoming a broker in the network as well, just based on this simple kind of treatment manipulation. So what I think these 3 studies kind of show is subtle, very subtle manipulations combined with kind of how people actually naturally behave can produce vastly different effects on how people end up forming their network. And there's a lot of opportunity. I think actually the experimental work on network formation is probably the kind of much less common because people don't have network data. They only have peer data, randomly assigned peer data and outcome data. So you don't see as much of this work. And I think there's a lot of opportunity here for the study of experiments and network dynamics. OK. And I think now, how much time do I have, Jim? I'm good? OK. So now we get all these estimates. What do we do with them? And I think the coolest stuff that's coming out now is designer networks. So which network structures maximize network level outcomes? So this is not a field experiment, but it is an experiment, and I think is a really important one, where Damon Centola did a study where he looked at the diffusion of behavior, I think it was health behavior, in artificial networks online. And the basic finding was networks that are highly clustered and then connected by ties, like kind of this, what he calls these clustered lattice networks, these, versus a random network, diffusion happens faster over these networks than these networks. That's what he said, right? And the mechanism is, in these networks, you're getting hit by information by multiple people in your network. Here, because information is kind of diffuse and network ties are really diffuse, if I tell someone in another part of a network about something, it's going to be much less likely that you're going to get hit with this information one time, but also much less likely that you're going to get hit with it again. And sometimes you need reinforcement. That it's not just like your mom telling you that you shouldn't be eating ice cream, but your kid's telling you this, and your wife telling you this, and your cousin's telling you this, that you shouldn't be eating ice cream at night. And so what he says is basically there are network structures that are actually much more conducive to diffusion than other structures. So not a field experiment. I'll tell you about an experiment that I think is amazing. It hasn't been published yet. It's under review right now at the Journal of Political Economy by a set of economists at various universities. And what they do is they go to 200 villages in Malawi. And one of the challenges in a lot of these contexts is technology, particularly farming technology, has diffused slowly. And what we want to do is make effective farming technology diffuse fast. And so they go into these 200 villages, and what they do is they basically measure their networks. They actually do network surveys in these villages. And then they say, OK, we have this technology called pit farming. I'm not going to go into detail what it is. It's not as important. But there are a lot of different ways that we can inject the kind of new technology into each of these villages. We can choose different people to tell about these technologies in each of these different villages. We can tell the village leader, right? We can actually use network theory and basically pick out people who have high closeness centrality and tell them, or the top 3 people who have high closeness centrality. We can use geography. We should basically maximize the entry points so that people who are neighbors can diffuse this information to their neighbors. And the other thing they did is they said, well, we can actually use this idea of complex contagion proposed by Damon Centola, where people need to be hit with the information multiple times for them to adopt it. And so what they did is they did simulations, a whole bunch of simulations on these networks, and they basically identified, you can't really see the colors, but these colors here on these graphs are the injection points depending on which characteristic they use, whether simple contagion, you just need to be hit with the information once, complex contagion, where you need to be hit with it multiple times by different people, geography, simple and complex, or we just basically use the village elder. And then what they do is they go into a bunch of these villages and then use the algorithm to decide, well, flip coins and decide, OK, this is a complex contagion village. This is a simple contagion village. This is a blah, blah, blah village. This is a village leader village. And then over 3 years, they measure the adoption of this technology. And what they end up finding is really, really interesting. The complex contagion stuff that we learned about in online networks was robust, with a robust predictor of overall level of adoption in the villages in a randomized control trial. And so I think this paper is really excellent for a lot of different reasons. It's something that we care about, farming technology. It is many, many villages, so it's a lot of different whole networks across many, many villages. They take network theory seriously and say, the network has a structure, and people in that network have different roles to play, and we should think about where we should inject this new information to maximize the spread in the network. They take actual sociology very seriously and use the models. They test the models in a rigorous way, and then they get these 3-year outcomes which show something that actually now has a real kind of outcome that shows that, yeah, technology diffuse faster. The experiment probably cost $1 million to do, just give you a ballpark number. Maybe even more, because they had to do multiple waves of the survey, 200 villages, the actual technology, the education, all that. But we learned something. But one of the most interesting things about this is everyone, I've seen this paper presented 3 times now, and I always chuckle when someone asks this, but they said, well, is this cost effective? Are we going to go and measure networks in all of these different villages and then go and do the simulation and then do the injection point? Is that just even feasible? And the answer is probably not. So another really interesting question is, how do we take kind of complex ideas from the network, and can we reduce them down into simple heuristics that we can use and apply much more cheaply than doing this? And I think they're kind of at that stage now. But I thought this was and this is cutting edge. It hasn't been published yet. All right, let me give you another example. Paper published in 2013, and by one of the same authors that wrote kind of the seminal piece on the peer effects. Yeah, 5 minutes. This is my last one. And I love this paper. So Bruce Sacerdoti is also co-author here. So they go into West Point, and West Point randomly assigns cadets to squadrons, and I think that's what they're called. And like you can estimate a peer effects model here is like, what's the grade of a cadet as a function of their own grade and the grade of their randomly assigned cadet mates, and the interaction between those two. So main effect of your own outcome, your own background, your peers, and the complementarity, the interaction between you and your peer. So they get these models, looks like this, right? And they say, well, now we have a regression from which we want to basically have a policy intervention. Can we use this knowledge that we now have about the kind of nature of peer effects to actually design super squadrons? And so what they did was they take these regressions and then they basically optimally design squadrons to maximize learning. And they did this, and actually students had worse outcomes in their optimally designed squadrons than in the completely random ones. And the reason is, it's really interesting, is that students did not form ties actually with the people that they were randomly assigned to a squadron with, because they felt like they were in a social engineering project. Yeah, and it's like the reverse Hawthorne or whatever it is, right? And what that, I think, tells me, again, is that you cannot, and what the mistake they made, again, is you cannot ignore the fact that people have relationships, and relationships matter, and they care. People in your study care about their relationships. And to their credit, at the back of this paper, they did a network survey, 25% response rate, but they did a survey, and they found that mechanism that basically people did not interact with their randomly assigned squadron mates. They went and tried to find other people that they could actually benefit from. So now the big question is, for policy, what do these estimates mean? And we don't know the answer. Because in order for these experiments to have policy implications, we should be able to use those estimates to design better policies. And the first attempt at doing that failed miserably. I'll just give you another example really quick of not a network study, but of a study trying to use the estimates coming out of regressions to design policy. Roland Fryer, who's like one of my research heroes, did a study in the Houston schools. The economists have a theory of comparative advantage. You should do what you're best at. So the Houston schools were organized where one teacher taught all the subjects to all the students. And if anyone looks at that, that's highly inefficient. Sharique should teach everybody English because that's what his best subject. Jamie should teach everybody math because that's her best subject, and so on and so forth. So they basically got what are called teacher value added scores for subjects, and they found out who was the best at what subject. And then in half the Houston schools, they basically made a curriculum change. They basically made the teacher who was best at the specific subject teach only that subject. And then they left the other schools, other random schools, with the old schedule where one teacher taught all the subjects. Guess what happened? It went really bad. The performance declined across all subjects. Now, what happened? And they don't have kind of network survey data or anything, but he talks about it in a little bit. And what he basically says is, in the schools where one teacher taught all the subjects, the teacher knew their student. And they could teach to where the student was at. And so they specialized in students, not in subjects. In the other situation, it was a factory. A student came in, they were all the same, you taught them like they were on an assembly line. And you miss the fact that students are very different. They're at very different levels, and you can't teach them all the same way. And that relationship that was formed between the student and the teacher in that one class, one teacher, all day setting, you cannot replicate in the people factory. So the importance of relationships in these kind of policy interventions are so important, in my opinion. And I think there's just a lot more research that we need to do on understanding that interaction between designing policies to maximize social learning and so on, but also keeping in mind that people have real relationships and it matters to them. OK, so in summary, 3 types of network field experiments: peer effects, network formation, and designing networks. I have given Jim these slides. The papers are ones that you should definitely read, especially mine. Thank you.
Questions or comments? Sorry.
Yeah.
So in your study with the Indian students, were you also able to take a look at network lines of appearance? And if so, thanks.
No, we. Yeah. OK, go ahead.
Were you able to look at the network of ties with appearance?
No, we were not. Yeah, we didn't collect that data. I mean, so it was just me and my co-author and I. We didn't have an infrastructure. We were both graduate students at that time. So we went and did these surveys kind of by ourselves. We did, in the first year, ask about parents and kind of how involved parents were in their child's education. That data didn't turn out to be all that good. It was very kind of not very, most of the kids, their parents were not educated. And so we didn't really see anything there, but we didn't measure that. Yeah. Yes?
It seems like your take is that you can't randomly induce ties. Is that true?
That is not my take. My take is that you can randomly induce ties, but even after randomization, there's a lot of selection going on. People still have a lot of leeway, because you can pair me sitting next to you and say, you guys interact. I mean, I can say, well, we didn't have an interesting conversation. I'm going to go back home, right? And so I still have a lot of leeway. So you can't randomly assign ties. You can only randomly assign opportunities, and ties are an endogenous consequence of those opportunities and who you are. All right.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.